In June of 2014, a man named Derek Broaddus finished painting a room in his brand new house, walked outside to check the mail, and found a plain white envelope with no return address. He had owned the house for exactly 3 days. He hadn't moved a single piece of furniture in yet. The letter inside was typed, addressed to the new owner, and it opened almost politely, like a neighbor introducing themselves. By the time Derek finished reading it, it didn't feel like a welcome anymore. It felt like a warning. He would go on to receive 3 more of these letters over the next year and a half. So would the police. So would 2 FBI profilers, several private investigators, and eventually, millions of people who watched this story become a Netflix series. Nobody has ever figured out who wrote them. This is the story of 657 Boulevard. To understand why this case is so strange, you have to start before the Broadduses ever existed to this story. 657 Boulevard was built in 1905. For 23 years before the Broadduses bought it, it belonged to a family named Woods. According to reporting by Reeves Wiedemann, who spent years investigating this case for New York Magazine, the Woods family had lived there without incident for over 2 decades. And then, shortly before they moved out, they received one letter, a single letter from someone calling themselves the Watcher. They didn't report it to the police. They didn't tell the next buyers either. The house went on the market and drew multiple offers above asking price. It was, by most accounts, the nicest home on the block. The Broadduses won that bidding process and closed on the house for $1.3 million in June of 2014. Derek was 40. He'd just been promoted to senior vice president at an insurance company in Manhattan. He and his wife, Maria, had 3 young kids, and this was supposed to be the house they'd raise them in. They didn't move in right away. They wanted to finish some renovations first, new siding, some cosmetic work. So for a few weeks, the house sat there, empty of people but full of contractors. That's exactly when the first letter arrived. The letter was addressed in blocky handwriting to the new owner. The typed message welcomed the family to the neighborhood, and then within a few lines, made clear this wasn't an ordinary welcome note. The writer said the house had been a work in progress for the better part of 2 decades, and asked why the Broadduses had chosen it, as if the house itself had been the one doing the choosing. Then it got specific. The letter referenced the construction trucks currently parked outside, trucks that had arrived only 1 day earlier. It asked about the Broadduses' 3 children. Without ever having met them, Derek called the Westfield Police Department. According to Wiedemann's reporting, the responding officer read the letter, reacted with visible alarm, and asked Derek a question that tells you a lot about how seriously this was taken from day one. Whether he had any enemies. The police recommended the family move construction equipment off the back porch in case whoever wrote this decided to use it. A few days later, the Broadduses went to a welcome barbecue thrown by a neighbor. They hadn't told anyone about the letter. Police had asked them to keep it quiet, since technically, every single person at that party was now a potential suspect. Maria would later describe spending the whole afternoon watching her kids run through the crowd and quietly panicking, unable to explain why. 2 weeks after the first letter, a second one arrived. This one went further. It referenced the children's birth order and their nicknames. It described the Broadduses' daughter accurately as an artist, and mentioned that the writer had seen her drawing inside an enclosed porch on the side of the house. Then it turned toward the basement. The letter asked whether the children would be too afraid to play down there alone, noting how far the basement was from the rest of the house. Far enough, it said, that no one upstairs would hear them if something happened. That line is the one that made Derek and Maria stop bringing their kids to the property entirely. 2 more letters followed over roughly the next year. They described the house as something the writer had inherited across generations, a grandfather who'd watched it in the 1920s, a father who'd watched it in the 1960s, And now the letter writer's own turn. They referred to the children collectively as young blood, language that shows up in nearly every account of this case because of how deliberately unsettling it was. The house wasn't just being watched, it was being described as something that fed on the families inside it. By the fourth letter, the tone had shifted from ownership to threat. The writer made it explicit. They were close enough to watch the house constantly, and they intended to keep doing it. Derek and Maria never spent a night there, not one in the entire time they owned it. Westfield PD treated the letters as a real threat from the start. This is a town that, per multiple reports, was ranked among the safest small cities in the country, which made a case like this genuinely disorienting for local police. They pulled the envelopes for forensic testing. DNA recovered from the glue suggested the sender might be a woman, though investigators were careful to note that wasn't conclusive. DNA transfer can happen in ways that don't point directly at the person who licked the envelope. Handwriting analysts studied the block lettering on the outside of each envelope. FBI profilers were brought in to build a psychological picture of the author, based on vocabulary, sentence structure, and the pseudo-literary tone of the letters themselves. Several investigators independently noted the writing was in its own disturbing way, well-crafted. Not the ramblings of someone incoherent, deliberate. None of it produced a name. The first real lead came from a neighbor, John Schmidt, who lived 2 doors down and mentioned an odd family living directly between his house and the Broadduses, the Langfords. Peggy Langford was in her 90s. Several of her adult children, all in their 60s, still lived with her. One of them, Michael Langford, was described by Schmidt as harmless but strange, a man with a beard, no job, and a habit of sitting outside for long stretches, not doing much of anything. The Broadduses' house painter, Bill Woodward, told Wiedemann something that made the Langfords impossible to ignore as suspects. He said he once looked out a window and saw an older man sitting in a chair in the yard behind the house, not facing his own home, but angled directly toward 657 Boulevard. Police interviewed Michael Langford multiple times. He denied any involvement. Investigators eventually collected DNA to compare against the sample from the envelope. It didn't match, and after that test, according to reporting on the case, police quietly dropped the Langford family as suspects altogether, without ever fully explaining to the Broadduses why they'd been so confident in that conclusion. A separate theory emerged around a local man nicknamed in press coverage the Gamer, someone with a documented habit of playing violent online games under a username tied to the word Watcher. The theory was that an obsession carried from a screen into real life, that someone role, playing as a menacing, all-seeing character, had picked a real house to project that persona onto. It's a theory that made headlines because it's genuinely unsettling, but as far as public reporting shows, it was never substantiated with hard evidence either. No arrest, no charge, just a name that circulated in the community and in early coverage of the case as one more unresolved thread. There's a theory that gets less attention than the Langfords or the Gamer, but it's arguably the most logical one on paper. The letters were postmarked from a postal distribution center in Kearny, New Jersey, geographically consistent with someone local. And the first letter arrived before the sale had even been publicly listed. The Woods family had never put up a for sale sign, and the letter showed up only a day after contractors began work on the house. That timing raised an obvious question. How would a random stranger know the sale was happening at all? Andrea Woods, one of the previous owners, raised her own theory directly to the Broadduses over email. She wondered whether the mention of contractor trucks and children in the letters pointed to someone in the immediate neighborhood, someone positioned to notice these details in real time, rather than research them from a distance. The Broadduses also initially wondered whether the Watcher might be a disappointed buyer, someone who'd lost the house to them in that competitive bidding process. The Woods family looked into it. One interested buyer had backed out after a medical diagnosis. Another had already bought elsewhere. Neither matched the profile of someone angry enough to do this. This theory, like the others, was never confirmed. Nobody was ever named, charged, or definitively cleared. The most painful theory for the family is also the one that got the most local traction. That there was no watcher at all. That Derek and Maria wrote the letters themselves. The reasoning went like this. Community members pointed out that the Broadduses had moved through a series of increasingly expensive homes in a fairly short window, from a house worth around $315,000 to one worth $770,000 to the $1.3 million purchase at 657 Boulevard, financed through refinancing along the way. Some neighbors speculated this pattern suggested the family had overextended themselves financially, and that the letters were a way to walk away from a house they'd grown to regret buying, either through an insurance angle, a lawsuit, or once the story went public and media companies came calling, a potential payday from selling the rights to their own story. The Broadduses have always firmly denied this, and it's worth being precise about what actually exists on the record. No investigator, journalist, or law enforcement agency has ever produced evidence supporting the hoax theory. It remained a rumor, a very persistent one, given how directly it attacked the family's credibility, but a rumor all the same. At one point, Derek publicly pushed back on a local outlet that had floated the theory, telling them directly, in his own words, that he was still waiting for an apology. What is true and verifiable is that the family did eventually sue the Woods family for failing to disclose the earlier letter they'd received before selling the house. A judge threw that case out, ruling there wasn't evidence the Woods family had deliberately concealed a threat they believed was credible. That lawsuit is also what pulled this story out of a quiet local matter and into the New Jersey press for the first time. For 6 months after the first letter, the Broadduses tried to figure out a way forward. They didn't want to live in the house. They struggled to sell it, because by then, word of the letters had spread through Westfield, and no buyer wanted a stalker attached to a deed. So they explored tearing it down and splitting the lot for redevelopment. That plan hit a strange, almost absurd obstacle. Under local zoning rules, each resulting plot would have come up 3 feet short of the minimum size required. The plan was rejected, so the house sat there, owned, insured, occasionally rented out, but never lived in by the people who bought it, for 5 years. The toll on the family was real and well documented. Multiple accounts describe Derek experiencing depression during this period, and Maria being diagnosed with symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress. Both described ongoing paranoia, the specific, exhausting kind that comes from knowing someone, somewhere, might genuinely be watching and having no way to know who. In 2019, 5 years after the first letter, the Broadduses finally sold 657 Boulevard for $959,000, roughly $400,000 less than what they'd paid for it. The buyer was a builder, and the house eventually passed to a new family. As of the most recent reporting on this case, that family has never received a letter from the Watcher. Reeves Wiedemann, who broke this story originally and revisited it again when the Netflix series came out in 2022, has said the Broadduses still live in the Westfield area, still decline nearly all media requests, and turned down multiple offers, including, reportedly, one from a producer who wanted to buy the actual house to use as a filming location for a horror project based on their own trauma. No one was ever arrested. No one was ever formally named as a suspect by police. The DNA didn't match anyone investigators tested. The handwriting analysis never produced a confirmed author. 4 theories remain on the table: a strange neighbor, an online obsessive, someone connected to the previous owners or the family itself, and every single one of them has holes serious enough that none has ever been proven. That's the part of this case that's genuinely rare. Most true crime stories eventually get an answer, even an ugly one. This one hasn't. The letters stopped arriving sometime around 2017. Nobody knows why they stopped either. 657 Boulevard is just a house again. A family lives there now, and by all accounts, an ordinary life is happening inside it. Whether that's because whoever wrote those letters lost interest, moved away, or simply stopped, that's one more thing this case has never answered.